Dire predictions of an overpopulated planet have been with us for centuries. What if they're just plain wrong? That's effectively what Daryl Bricker and John Ibbitson argue in their new book. It's called Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, and it brings collaborators Daryl Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, and Globe and Mail writer-at-large John Ibbitson to our studio tonight. Great to have you two gents here.
Thanks for having us.
Let's set this up. This will take a bit of time, so get comfy. 1968, Stanford University. Paul Ehrlich writes perhaps the most famous book on the fears of overpopulation. It's called The Population Bomb, and he begins the book thus. The battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death. A decade earlier, in 1958, the great prognosticator of societal doom, Aldous Huxley, had this to say in an interview with the great Mike Wallace. If you would, please.
Force which in general terms can be called overpopulation, the mounting pressure of population pressing upon existing resources. This, of course, is an extraordinary thing. Something is happening which has never happened in the world's history before. The whole essence of biological life on Earth is a question of balance, and what we have done is to practice death control in a most intensive manner, without balancing this with birth control at the other end.
And now one more, something for our generation here. 1973, Hollywood, Charlton Heston, Soylent Green. Let's go.
New York City, in the year 2022. Nothing runs anymore, nothing works, but the people are the same, and the people will do anything to get what they need.
This is the police.
What they need most is Soylent Green.
The supply of Soylent Green has been exhausted.
Remember what Soylent Green is?
Oh, yeah. We talk about it in the book.
We won't give it away. We won't give it away. Okay, John, you first. The fears of overpopulation clearly have been with us for a long time. To what extent do you feel this book puts that to rest?
Well, not to rest. It raises a question about it, though. And by the way, those fears are with us still. If you're watching Netflix, if you're going to the movies, how often is the plot premised on the notion that we have so overpopulated the Earth that we've despoiled the atmosphere and we can only live on moons of Jupiter? So it's with us still. And not surprisingly, the United Nations Population Division believes that we will get to about 11.2 billion people by the end of the century, more than 4 billion, more than are around right now. And that's going to produce a lot of stress on the environment, on society. But there is a growing body of demographers who believe that the UN is wrong.
Well, let's put the numbers up since you've just brought it up. Go ahead, Sheldon. We'll get this graphic up. World population prediction. There it is in 2017 at 7.6 billion, and it goes up the year 2030 to 8.6. By the midway part of the century to 9.8 billion, and as John just suggested, by the end of the 21st century, 11.2 billion people on this planet. Okay, Mr. Bricker, what do you think of the prognostication?
Well, it's all based on a model that has a lot of problems with it. I mean, it's based on a model that I think has proved accurate in the past. I think it's got a pretty good record. But the problem that they've got is that there's things that are changing so rapidly that aren't taken into account in the way that they do the modeling, that they're missing the fact that the change that they suggest needs to happen has already started to happen and has been happening for a number of years.
The notion that this population bomb has been, over time, gathering steam and will eventually at some point explode is about the most conventional wisdom going today, and in fact, you can go decades, if not centuries, into the past. Where did you get the notion that this might not be accurate?
Well, it was in fact something that we had both been watching for some years. This demographer, and then that demographer, and then that demographer. William Lutz, I guess, is the best known of them in Vienna, and was saying, they're just not taking into account this, and they're just not taking into account that. And when you do take into account this and that, you discover it doesn't get to 11 billion by the end of the century. It gets to around 9 billion by the middle of the century, and then it starts to go down. For the first time in human history, we will be, over time, deliberately culling ourselves by having fewer babies than we need to reproduce. And there are great things about that and bad things about that, and no, we're going to talk about it. But that is what this group And I think a growing body of evidence in support of that group suggests it's going to happen.
We will go deeper on this, obviously, but is that essentially, in a nutshell, what it's about? In developed countries, we are having fewer children, and even in developing countries, they're having fewer children. Is that it?
Well, the key to that, though, is in developing countries, because the assumption is that what we're talking about in terms of a reduction in fertility in developed countries is a pretty well accepted fact now. I mean, you don't even have to go to the numbers, just look at your own families for the most part. I mean, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, people are having 2 kids or fewer. I mean, the fertility rate of Canada today is 1.6, but that matches all the Nordic countries, that matches all of Western Europe. And in fact, they got there faster, and now Europe is basically losing people every year. So everybody knows that, but 40% of the world's population lives in 2 places, India and China. And when you find out that China's got a birth rate of 1.5 and India has just been reported at a birth rate of 2.1, you sit back and say, well, maybe we're not going to explode.
You guys are not setting a very good example. 1 kid?
Correct.
No kids?
No kid.
Well, you're not exactly holding up your end of the bargain here, are you?
But we're representative.
You are representative, that is true. What have you found to be some of the major drivers of population decline?
There's really just one that matters more than any other, and it's urbanization. When you move from the countryside to the city, a bunch of things happen that result in fewer children. And for the first time in history, we are now a species that lives mostly in cities. Right now, 55% of humans live in cities. And essentially, what happens when you move to a city is a child stops being an asset and becomes a liability.
I love the way you describe that in the book. When they're on the farm,
it's another pair of hands to work in the fields, and when you're in the city, it's just another mouth to feed.
Yeah.
And then another thing that's even as important, if not more important, when you move from the countryside to the city, women acquire education. They have access now to state school systems that they didn't have when they were out in the village. They have access to media, and they have access to other women, and they become better educated. And as soon as women become better educated, as soon as they have any kind of ability to control any aspects of their destiny, the first thing they demand is the right to have some control over their own bodies. And once women have some control over their own bodies, the first thing they decide to do is have fewer children. And it is urbanization that is leading to an acceleration in the decline of birth rates throughout the developing world, in some of the biggest countries in the developing world.
you guys got to travel to a lot of places to write this book, and we are going to go figuratively to some of those places over the next several minutes. We'll end up at Canada, but let's start with the European Union, where you have a fertility rate reported here of 1.6 births per woman. What is the demographic story you see happening across Europe?
Rapidly aging, because that's the other part of this. We're not bringing in kids at the bottom. What we're really getting good at is keeping people on the planet. We're not good at making new people. We're really good at keeping them on the planet. So you've got a number of countries there that are now in a situation where they're losing population every year. So this is not something we're talking about that's going to be the future. This is something that's happening right now. And the factors that John pointed to are exactly what's happening. It's women taking control of over their own destiny, deciding that they're going to have smaller families, and it has now become, as one demographer has described it, a low fertility trap.
Isn't this a bit shocking, though, given that, John? I mean, Italy is the most Catholic country on earth. Spain is a very Catholic country. You would think these very Catholic countries, with the influence of the church, or perhaps not anymore, would be having more kids.
2 other things that happen when you urbanize. And by the way, we haven't said, and probably should, the number 2.1. 2.1 is the number of children on average that women need to have in order to sustain a population.
Can I just stop you there? Like 2 I get. Why 2.1?
Children who don't live to become women themselves, that's essential. Basically, infant mortality.
Or aren't capable.
Got it.
So if you're over 2.1, your society grows in population. If you're under 2.1, you start to lose population. And another thing that happens when you move to the countryside to the city is the power of religion declines. There isn't a religion in this world that in its conventional form does not agree with every other religion in this world that men are more important than women. Women should stay in the home and look after the needs of the family and the man, and that women should have lots of kids. That's pretty universally a constant. But when you urbanize, the power of religion collapses, and suddenly people stop going to mass or whatever it is they're not going to, and fertility rates decline. Also, the power of the clan. In a village, It's all about you and your family and your extended family. So all those aunties who are trying to convince you that it's time you settled down and got married and had a kid. You move to the city, it's not about the aunties anymore. It's about your coworkers. And when was the last time a coworker urged you to have a baby?
Good question. Does it ever happen anymore?
Not when I'm around.
Not in the offices that I've worked in.
Yeah.
No, it's
Let's talk about immigration policy as it and the differences between Western European countries, which have tended to be more open to immigration, and Eastern European ones, which have tended, certainly lately, to be much more closed. How does that have an impact on all of what we're talking about?
Well, one of the solutions to this, if you believe that population decline is a problem that you need to deal with, is immigration. Canada is an example of a country that's figured out a way to deal with this. There are not many other countries that have. The United States, certainly, Australia to a certain extent, but most of Europe has now, in contemporary times, really struggled with this question. So one of the issues that they all deal with politically is populism, and one of the biggest drivers of populism and populist views, nativist voting, has been change of culture due to immigration. So it is a temporary solution, but it's a very, very difficult solution to implement. Japan, for example, one of its obvious solutions is losing about 400,000, 450,000
We're going to get there. Hold off on
people a
Japan.
year, but they don't immigrate. There's
Right.
no immigration.
We're going to get there. The province of Quebec has for a long time tried to pay women to have more kids.
Yeah.
Spain created, do I have this right, a sex czar?
Yes.
Yeah.
To attempt to get people to have more children. They have a birth rate right now of 1.3 births per woman. Historically, John, how successful have these attempts been to get people to have more children?
Not successful enough and never permanently successful. The whole Scandinavian Nordic model was actually premised on concerns that dated back before the Second World War, that their populations were going to go into decline because they had very low birth rates. So, extended parental leave, state support for daycare, child payments, you can ride on the tram for free if you've got a baby stroller. All of those things do have some impact. Quebec's move to subsidized daycare did have some impact. It brought Quebec from the lowest fertility rate in Canada up to about the middle of the pack. But it never brings you up to 2.1. No society has ever been able to convince people to get back up to a replacement rate. And these are very expensive programs. And almost invariably, whenever the next recession hits, those programs get cut back.
First thing to go. Okay, should we go to Japan now?
Sure.
Here's the thing. Japan in the 20th century was an economic marvel. But now you've got an old society having kids at a rate of 1.4 births per woman. Take us down the road and talk to us about the potential economic consequences of an old and shrinking Japan.
Well, the biggest problem that they have is they don't have consumers. When old people don't buy the same number of things that young people do, and if we have an economy that's based on consumption, you're always going to struggle with that. And when you take a look at the cost of a population like that, old populations are extremely expensive populations. Pensions, healthcare, all of the issues that you have to deal with as people age are extremely expensive for a shrinking number of people in the population to pay for. So the potential for a real generational difficulty in Japan is looming. It's already started now, but it's really going to be a problem as they roll into the future.
Now, for many countries, John, in this pickle, they would simply open the doors to immigration a little wider and settle it. You tell us that it really isn't an option for Japan. How come?
Well, it's cultural. And it's not just Japan, of course. China. We are still talking about the world's largest country in terms of population, not for long, but right now, 1.3 billion people. They have a fertility rate of 1.5. They're half a baby shy. Now, they've lifted the disastrous one-child policy in hopes that they could get people to have more kids. That won't work. The low fertility trap, as it's called, says that once a society gets used to a low birth rate, it gets used to a low birth rate. People just have one or two kids or maybe just a dog. So China's fertility rate is not going to go up, or at least not up much. It's going to start losing population in the next decade. And in fact, the kind of consequences, economic and geopolitical, of Chinese population decline are something I think we haven't thought about and need to think about. But the Chinese just don't accept immigrants. Eastern Asian countries just don't accept immigrants. Just as in Eastern European now, increasingly there are countries there that say, don't tell us about the numbers, don't show us the reports, we just want to be Hungarians living in Hungary and keep the foreigners out. And if you have that attitude, and I understand that attitude, it's not endemically racist, it is just very culturally exclusionary. But if you have that attitude, things are not going to go well for you in this century.
Do they not understand that that's possibly a death sentence?
They understand it. I think they do. They just don't care. I mean, they would rather shrink and be united than expand and be divided.
If China becomes more like Japan, and I guess part of the issue here is because of the one China policy, you've got many more men than women. So you've got many fewer women to have these
60
babies.
million.
60 million more men than women.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay, 50 years down the road, what does China therefore look like?
It's a real mess. And the reason is because you're going to have a lot of frustrated men who are never going to be able to fulfill what one of their cultural destinies is, which is to create a family in order to be able to take care of their parents, because they don't really have a state welfare system there. So it's going to be an extremely difficult problem. I actually like the way the economists put this, which is China is going to get old before it gets rich enough to be old.
It's going to be old before it's rich enough to be old. Interesting. India, I mean, again, the conventional wisdom on India was that women there are having lots and lots and lots of babies.
All wrong.
But apparently, you've reported that it's 2.4 births per woman, which is sort of above the replacement rate, but not very much. John, the United Nations predicts their population will peak in the year 2060 at 1.7 billion, up from 1.3 billion today. Do you agree with that prediction?
No, we don't. And by the way, our book is wrong. We might as well just get it out there right now. In the book, we say that the fertility rate of India is 2.4 births per woman, which is a modestly increasing population. But when you've got as many people as India, that's a lot of growth. But the Lancet published a report in November, sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, literally with hundreds of researchers from dozens of countries around the world. Almost all the data in the Lancet is different from the data in our book, and it's all lower than it is in our book. And one of the pieces of data in our book reports that India is now at 2.1.
So it's worse, actually.
India is at replacement rate.
And the interesting thing was, when I was in India doing the research for the book, Indian demographers were telling me that, but the UN still had India at 2.1.
Why does the UN
2.4.
2.4. Why does the UN persist in putting out information that seems to be incorrect?
Well, because they have an extremely conservative view of population modeling. And that extremely conservative view says that if it didn't happen before, it won't happen in the future. It's all based on past estimates and what's happened in countries previously. So if cultural change is happening to the degree that John and I are talking about, which is through the process of urbanization, through the process of women changing their lives, and it's all happening in front of you, their models can't take it into account. But I think what you're going to see from the UN progressively as we go through this next decade is they're going to continue to adjust their estimates down. They've adjusted India down most recently from 2.4 to 2.3.
I don't want to ascribe motive here, but the fact is, the United Nations gets money from countries around the world to deal with population issues. If the notion of overpopulation ceases to be that big an issue, are they worried about not having their bread buttered enough anymore?
We don't want to ascribe motive either.
Well, but I mean,
Enough said, eh?
But you take a look at it and you say to yourself, conservative estimates have worked for you in the past. I actually, you can put it down to political motives. I put it down to statistics.
Okay.
Actually.
Let's continue our trip around the world. Now we're going to go to Brazil. Brazil, where again, one would assume a fertility rate that would be very high. You've got it at 1.8 births per woman, which clearly is not replacement. What is the mystery of their fertility rate?
For me, this was just the most fascinating thing about the book in terms of discoveries, because we couldn't figure this out. 1.8, it is a poor society. It is a society where machismo is still rampant. Women are very much constricted in their rights, especially women in the favelas, in the poorer parts of the country. Women have babies early in Brazil, which means they should have them often, and yet 1.8. So when I went to Sao Paulo, talked to a group of researchers, talked to some university students, went into a favela, and two things we discovered, and this is well documented. One is they've electrified the favelas, and as a result of electrification, there are now televisions in the favelas. Not sort of every shanty, but enough for people to gather around. What do women gather around and watch? They watch the soap operas, the Brazilian soap operas. Telenovelas.
In the favelas.
Where they find wealthy, sophisticated women living extremely unconventional lives in terms of domestic relationships and not having children. And it produces we want to be like them effect. Secondly, there's public health care in Brazil, but it's not very good. When a woman wishes herself to stop having kids, the guy who's coming home on Saturday night may have different ideas, but she no longer wants kids. She goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, and again, this is very well documented, I can declare that you have a problem pregnancy. As a result of having that risk birth, we can perform a cesarean section. I will get more money as the doctor, and while I'm in there, I'll do tubal ligation. It's called shutting down the factory. And sterilization has become one of the most prominent means of birth control in Brazil. And that just, for me, in terms of the unintended consequences of public policy, that's got to win a prize.
And by the way, it's the same in India. They have the highest rate of sterilization of any country in the world. So even if they wanted to turn it around, they can't. But also, and this is a shocking thing about India, we do see it in China. Everybody seems to acknowledge that there's a deficit of women in China. It's the same size deficit in India. Same type of cultural exclusion of female children.
And by the way, we are talking about sex-selective abortions.
Yeah.
We're having more men than women because they are deciding to have abortions until they get a boy.
Okay, continuing our look around the world. Let's go to Africa. Kenya. Big birth rate still in Kenya, yes?
No.
Not even in Kenya.
Kenya has gone through an amazing transformation over the space of the last 25 years. So even in the last decade, Kenya has gone from a birth rate of roughly around 5 to somewhere between 3 and 4. It's lost a whole kid in a decade. And it really is a product of two things. One of them is massive amounts of urbanization, slower than it's happened in other places, but they're now going through the same things that Brazil has gone through and other countries have gone through. And also education and the influence of education. There's has been a big push on public education in Kenya. Now girls and boys in high schools sit the same exams. Girls tend to do about the same, a little bit better than the boys, but the actual proportion participating is almost universal now. So the effects of education that we were talking about are finding their way deeply into Kenyan culture, and it's having a big impact on their fertility.
Back to North America. In fact, America. And you write, of the 3 global nuclear superpowers, demographically, the American advantage is decisive. What does that mean, John?
It means that the Americans welcome immigrants, or at least they used to. Now, the Americans only bring in immigrants at about 1/3 the rate of Canada on a per capita basis, but they still bring in 1 million people a year, and that's a lot. And they have a huge advantage in that not just economically powerful, but culturally powerful. People want to come to the United States. Also, the weather is good in most parts of it. So the United States will be the only one of the superpowers that continues to grow its population if it chooses to in this century. You could have, and this is only one variable, but it's a reasonable variable, you could have a United States that is approaching 500 million people by the end of the century, and a China that's down to between 600 and 700 million people by the end of the century. How would that change the geopolitical nature of the world in which China didn't have that many more people than the United States? So it really could be a second American century, but they have to decide if they want to close their borders and shut themselves off and commit the same kind of demographic suicide that Europe and parts of Asia are committing, because that could ultimately be the ultimate and most baleful legacy of Donald Trump.
So it's interesting, the one-child policy, which has been so bad for China, the equivalent of that in the United States could be its increasingly restrictive immigration and refugee policies. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is one of the advantages that Canada has. I mean, there are estimates that now show that Canada could have the same size population, for example, as Germany by the end of the century. I mean, we're
closing up on 100 million.
Yeah, we're growing rapidly, but almost all of our population growth now comes from 2 sources: immigration and aging. So we're really good at keeping people alive. We're really bad at making new people.
1.6, right?
1.6.
1.6 is the Canadian fertility rate right now. 1.6 kids per woman.
By the way, one of the things that surprised me in the book, Indigenous fertility rates. The everyone knows argument that there's a very high birth rate among Indigenous Canadians, and that they're going to become a larger and larger portion of our society. The fertility rate among Indigenous Canadians is 2.5. It is falling rapidly. This is the last large generation of Indigenous young. And this is happening not just in Canada, but in the United States and New Zealand and Australia.
yeah, too.
Indigenous fertility rates are going down just as they are going down everywhere else. And why wouldn't they?
If we see a world 50 years from now, where 50 to 100 years from now, where the rest of the world's population is shrinking, but ours is increasing, how does that change potentially Canada's place in the world 50 to 100 years from now?
Well, all those aspirations that we have about being a country that punches above its weight, well, we'll actually have weight. I think we'll become a more significant player in the world. But the other thing is, I think we become a significant example. So if a country wants to be able to deal with this population problem that they have, which is the problem not of overpopulation, but of underpopulation, Canada is a place that you can look as to how you can deal with that. And a lot of that has to do with building the type of immigration policy that people can accept in the country, because they're not just going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts. And then also create a type of culture that, through multiculturalism, that's tolerant enough that you can absorb this type of cultural change that comes in through the process of immigration. So we're I think, and one of the things that we say in the book is that we're an example of how a country can deal with this problem as it moves through this century.
Well, let's see, because I don't have to tell the two of you, as we go closer towards October in a federal election, you will be writing about, and you will be surveying public opinion about, what people think on a variety of topics, including immigration. If you were a center-left party in Canada trying to convince people of the good things about immigration, or if you were a more conservative party that believed in immigration, what's the case that you want to be making right now in the lead up to a federal election?
Well, let's make the center-right case, because the center-left case is obvious.
Pretty easy, yeah.
But the center-right case is, in fact, the Canadian case. This country has pursued, since the late 1800s, an utterly selfish policy of bringing in immigrants to grow our economy. It was harder to convince people to come to Canada than to come to the United States. So we had to really go and beat the bushes. Clifford Sifton, the immigration minister, sent agents out into Ukraine and Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe and said, come to Canada, it's not as bad as you think. And so we have entrenched in our ethos, and you saw this in the Stephen Harper government, which increased immigration levels and reformed the immigration system throughout its decade in power. The ethos that, yes, we should bring in some refugees because we are a compassionate country and people are in trouble around the world, but mostly we should just strip the brightest and best out of other developing countries and bring them here to grow our own economy and our own society. And I mean, you can debate whether it's ethical to do such a thing, but we do it. If you look at the current system for foreign students, we've, I think, quadrupled the number of foreign students in our universities and colleges now. They are entitled automatically to a work permit as soon as they graduate, and they are basically guaranteed permanent resident status if they want it, because we know they are going to make great Canadian citizens. That is a terrific, selfish, self-interested, capitalist right-wing argument for large numbers of immigrants.
Do you see any right-wing party making that argument in the lead up to the election?
The Conservatives, if they want to have any hope of winning the next election, because the counter-argument, which is we need to preserve Canadian culture and Canadian identity, they're stealing our jobs, they're taking our wealth from us, that argument is not going to play, as you well know, Steve, in the ridings around the big cities throughout the country that are full of immigrants and that elect the government.
And we wrote another book about that.
I do recall.
We're regressing now.
You gents might have been here on that one too.
Yeah.
Let me read this to you, Darrell, and then I'll get you to comment on this. Sheldon, if you would. This excerpt from the book, Empty Planet. In the broader context, refugee movements are insignificant. The real tectonic forces reshaping societies and economies is the decade after decade flow of economic migrants from poorer countries to richer countries. That shift in labor isn't accelerating. It's slowing down. It will slow down even more in the future. We are faced with a looming shortage of migrants. Again, this goes against all the conventional wisdom and so much of the noise that we hear on media nowadays. But do you see a future, Darrell, for Canada where we simply won't be able to grow because there will be a shortage of migrants?
Yeah, that's why I refer to it as a short to medium term solution to this issue, if you see it as a problem. The reason is because the places that we bring most of our immigrants in from are mostly Pacific nations. So the #1 source of immigrants to Canada these days has changed from the Philippines to India again. This year, yeah, it's back up to India, the Philippines, and China. All of those places are going through this population transformation that we're talking about, and they're running out of young people to send us. And as they become more middle class, as their economies continue to develop, because the biggest growth of middle class people now is in Asia, as that happens, the incentive for them to leave is not going to be as big. So there's actually going to be a competition for immigrants. Where things are going to now focus probably is they're going to move to Africa. So the question is, are they going to become a middle class area? Are they going to go through the type of population change quicker even than Asia has gone through it to deprive us of an ability to be able to bring new people in?
John, I got one last question for you, which is this. Every person I've talked to about this book and what the premise of the book is says, well, that can't be true. You are still spitting into the wind for a lot of people in this country and around the world who just simply don't believe even the empirically provable facts which you have in this book. What do you say about that?
I think we just want to get the idea out there. I think it is reasonable to read Empty Planet and at the end of it go, all right, they've made their case. Let's at least get a debate started. Let's get credible voices discussing population prospects. Let's look at the implications of urbanization for fertility rates. We interviewed the director of the United Nations Population Division. So he's fully represented, and his views are fully represented in the book. So let's get the conversation going, because there are big environmental, all good by the way, great environmental consequences if our numbers don't get past 9 billion. There are serious economic consequences. There are intriguing geopolitical consequences. And we can't even look at those consequences until and unless we at least start to look at the possibility that this scenario may be the one that plays out, not the conventional one.
Well, we are happy to help kickstart that discussion here on TVO. And I must say, John, Darrell, I think I read the book pretty carefully. I'm not sure I saw John's favorite word in the English language in this book, which you use in every other book and in every other interview that you've done on TVO. Do you know the word I'm talking about?
No.
He used to play for the Raptors, actually. You always say, oh, that's Bosch. Do you use the word Bosch in this book?
Bosch does not appear in the book.
I don't think it did. Okay.
Our editor might have stabbed it.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm very disappointed, John. Your track record is now, you're dead to me. Anyways, that's Darrell Bricker and John Ibbitson. They have written a provocative and fascinating new book called Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, and we're delighted that it's brought you to our studio here tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.